There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a player the morning before everything changes. Not the silence of doubt, something quieter than that, and heavier. Aaliyah Boston has lived inside that silence more than once. She has sat with the knowledge that what she was building was real, that the work was honest, and that the recognition would come not from demanding it, but from making it impossible to ignore. When the Indiana Fever front office opened negotiations on her contract extension, Boston didn't arrive at that table as someone chasing a number. She arrived as someone who had already decided what kind of player she was going to be, and more importantly, what kind of teammate. That distinction matters more than most people understand when they look at the final figures on a contract and try to reduce everything to who got what. The deal that emerged 4 years, $6.3 million, the largest total contract in WNBA history, wasn't just a salary agreement. It was a philosophical statement about how a franchise and a player can be aligned on something deeper than individual reward. Boston structured her first-year salary deliberately below what she could have commanded, not out of naivety, but out of a clear-eyed understanding of what she wanted Indiana to become. That kind of thinking doesn't come from an agent's spreadsheet. It comes from a player who has spent years watching how teams are built and broken, and who made a conscious choice about which kind of story she wanted to be part of. The weight she carried into that moment wasn't pressure. It was purpose. Aaliyah Boston grew up in Street Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands, which is not a place that produces WNBA #1 overall draft picks by accident. The island has no professional basketball infrastructure, no AAU pipeline feeding into elite prep programs, no conveyor belt that takes a talented kid and deposits her 4 years later into a college program with a national profile. What it has is sun, an ocean, and a culture that values community over individual achievement in ways that the mainland sports machine rarely teaches and almost never rewards. Boston absorbed that early. She learned basketball not as a vehicle for personal elevation, but as something practiced in service of the people around her. That foundation, unglamorous, unmarketed, deeply human, is the thing that makes her approach to the game resistant to the ego inflation that swallows so many talented players before they ever reach their potential. She arrived at South Carolina under Dawn Staley and immediately encountered a program built on standards that had nothing to do with highlight reels. Staley's system demands accountability at every position, every possession, every practice. It is a program that has produced WNBA talent consistently, because it treats the development of character as inseparable from the development of skill. Boston didn't just survive that environment, she thrived inside it in a way that revealed something essential about who she already was before she got there. She became the kind of player coaches trust in the moments that matter most. Not because she was the loudest or the most visibly aggressive, but because her consistency was so complete that it became its own form of leadership. The island had already taught her that. South Carolina simply gave it a stage. The WNBA's old collective bargaining structure was built on a logic that made sense in a different era. Veterans earned their money through longevity. Rookies served their time on entry-level deals regardless of how quickly they proved themselves. The system rewarded patience and penalized excellence that arrived ahead of schedule. For a player like Boston, decorated in her 3rd season, already reshaping what her franchise looked like on both ends of the floor, the old framework would have kept her financially undervalued for years, simply because the calendar said so. It wasn't malicious. It was institutional inertia, the kind that accumulates when a league spends decades operating under the assumption that the existing structure is the only viable one. What changed everything wasn't outrage or protest. It was negotiation, specifically the inclusion of a single provision in the new collective bargaining agreement that rewired the entire salary conversation for young elite players. The epic provision, exceptional performance on initial contract, did something structurally radical without announcing itself as radical. It created a mechanism for players who earned MVP recognition or all WNBA selections within their first 3 seasons to renegotiate out of their rookie deals and into maximum money immediately. Boston qualified. Her all-WNBA second-team selection in 2025, her 3rd consecutive All-Star appearance. Her sustained dominance in the post, all of it met the threshold the provision was designed to reward. The Indiana Fever front office understood the window the moment it opened and moved without hesitation. That speed wasn't luck. It was preparation meeting a system that finally, for the first time, was built to reward exactly the kind of player Boston had already become. What makes Aaliyah Boston genuinely difficult to defend has less to do with athleticism than with intelligence. She reads defensive positioning before the ball arrives, which means by the time she catches it in the post, she has already decided what she is going to do with it. That pre-catch processing is rare. Most post players react to what the defense gives them after the catch. Boston anticipates it before, which compresses the time a defender has to recover and makes her finishing percentages in high-contact situations look almost unreasonable on paper. Her footwork is not flashy. It is precise, economical, built for efficiency rather than spectacle. She seals position early, catches the ball in high-percentage spots, and either finishes or draws contact in a way that makes every possession feel predetermined from her side of the floor. The paint, for Boston, is not a place she attacks. It is a place she already occupies. What that interior presence does to an entire defensive structure is something the box score captures poorly. When a post defender is being walked to her spot on every possession, the perimeter defenders around her are forced to make impossible choices, collapse to help and surrender open looks outside, or stay home and watch Boston work one-on-one. Indiana's offensive system under Steph White is designed around exactly that tension. Boston's presence in the paint creates the gravity that makes Caitlin Clark's shooting and playmaking exponentially more dangerous, and Clark's gravity on the perimeter creates the space that makes Boston's post work cleaner. They are not two stars competing for the same real estate. They are two players whose specific skills expand each other's effectiveness in ways that coaches spend entire careers trying to engineer and almost never find. The 2025 WNBA playoff semifinals against the Las Vegas Aces were not supposed to test Indiana the way they did. 6 players missing from the roster. Clark sideline, a travel schedule that put the Fever on the road against a team built specifically for deep playoff runs with home court advantage and a full complement of weapons. On paper, the series looked like an obligation Vegas would fulfill before moving on to more serious business. What happened instead was something the basketball world did not fully process in real time because the narrative around that series got consumed by controversy before the actual basketball could be properly examined. Boston walked into that environment and performed at a level that should have reshaped how people understood her place in the league. Instead, the conversation drifted, as it often does, toward everything except what was happening on the floor between two players in the post. The fracture point for Indiana wasn't talent or effort. It was structural. Lexi Hull played the entire series with a back injury sustained in Game 1, defending Jackie Young while visibly compromised and still hitting 5 threes in Game 3. The Fever were competing against Las Vegas and against their own injury report simultaneously, and they pushed the series to its limit anyway. For Boston, those games contained something more personal than a playoff result. They were the clearest demonstration yet that her game was not dependent on ideal circumstances, that she could impose her will on the best defensive player in the league in a hostile building with a depleted roster around her. Losing that series hurt, but what Boston proved inside it was something that winning can sometimes obscure, that her foundation was deeper than the scoreboard suggested. The version of Aaliyah Boston that shows up in playoff games and contract announcements is the visible product of something almost nobody witnesses. Her preparation is not built around dramatic gestures or publicized training regimens. It is built around repetition so consistent that it stops feeling like discipline and starts feeling like identity. The footwork that makes her post-game look inevitable in real time exists because she has practiced the same ceiling sequences, the same catch positions, the same finishing angles thousands of times in gyms where nobody was watching and nothing was at stake except the standard she holds herself to. That kind of preparation doesn't produce highlights. It produces reliability, which is a far more valuable thing when a playoff series is on the line and your team needs someone to make the right play on the 12th consecutive difficult possession of the fourth quarter. What separates Boston's approach from players who have comparable physical tools is the intellectual dimension of her preparation. She studies defensive tendencies the way a point guard studies ball screen coverages systematically, with specific situational awareness that she then translates into positional decisions before games are played. Her efficiency in the paint isn't accidental contact generation. It is the result of knowing exactly where defenders want to push her, exactly where they are vulnerable, and exactly how to use her body to create the angles that make finishing or drawing fouls a repeatable outcome rather than a fortunate one. Dawn Staley's program at South Carolina instilled the foundation of that approach, but the depth it has reached in Indiana is entirely Boston's own construction, built quietly across years of unseen hours that the highlight packages will never fully represent. The exchange that followed Boston's contract announcement was 11 words total. Clark posted, "Absolutely. Congrats, AB." Boston replied, "God is great. Let's go." No press releases, no coordinated messaging, no carefully worded statements designed for public consumption. Just two players who are clearly operating from the same internal compass, responding to a shared moment the way people do when the relationship underneath it is genuine. That kind of dynamic doesn't get manufactured by a front office or engineered by a coaching staff. It develops through shared experience, through practices where trust gets built possession by possession, through playoff runs, where adversity reveals exactly who each person is when the stakes are real and the circumstances are difficult. What Clark and Boston have constructed together inside that locker room is the kind of partnership that franchises spend decades trying to find and almost never do on purpose. Kelsey Mitchell's role in this ecosystem is something that deserves more attention than it typically receives. She was the player who kept Indiana functional during the stretches of the 2025 playoff run when Clark was unavailable, and the offensive burden fell entirely on whoever was willing to carry it. Mitchell carried it, not reluctantly, but completely, with the kind of performance that only happens when a player has fully internalized what the team needs from her, rather than what the moment could mean for her individually. Boston's decision to structure her contract with a deliberately lower first-year salary was directly responsible for Indiana's ability to retain Mitchell at supermax level. That financial choice was also a relational one, a statement about which people Boston believed were essential to what Indiana was building, and a willingness to absorb short-term personal costs to keep them there. Game 4 of the 2025 semifinals against Las Vegas is the game that deserves to be studied carefully by anyone trying to understand what Aaliyah Boston actually is as a basketball player. Indiana was shorthanded, on the road, facing a Vegas roster that had been constructed specifically to win in exactly these circumstances. Boston generated 13 free throw attempts in that game alone, a number that tells you everything about how she was operating in the post and how much contact she was drawing every time the ball came to her near the basket. Her approach that night was methodical in a way that went beyond individual skill. She sealed position before the defense could establish itself, caught the ball in spots where her options were already favorable, and then executed with a patience that made the interior look like a place she controlled rather than contested. Wilson, defending directly against her on possession after possession, could not find a response that worked. The film from that series reveals something the final score obscured. Boston was winning her individual matchups so consistently and so completely that Vegas's entire defensive structure was being bent out of shape by her presence. When a post defender is getting walked to her spot repeatedly, the perimeter collapses inward to help, which opens the floor for exactly the kind of ball movement Steph White's system is designed to generate. Boston wasn't just scoring, she was dismantling the architecture of Vegas's defense from the inside out, creating problems that extended far beyond her own statistics. Indiana lost that series, but the reason they pushed it as far as they did, undermanned, injured, playing away from home, was because Boston refused to allow the circumstances to determine what was possible. That refusal, quiet and physical and completely without drama, is the truest measure of what she brought to those games. The statistics that follow Aaliyah Boston through box scores and efficiency metrics are impressive in the way that all elite player statistics are impressive. They confirm what the eye test already knows and provide the numerical scaffolding for arguments that don't actually need them. But the thing Boston has built in Indiana that no spreadsheet captures is a culture of collective accountability that has become the Fever's most underappreciated competitive advantage. It shows up in the way her teammates talk about her, not in terms of what she produces individually, but in terms of what the environment feels like when she is inside it. She is described consistently as the player who keeps everybody settled, who manages situations before they become problems, who absorbs pressure without redistributing it onto the people around her. That is a form of leadership that wins championships in the long run and almost never appears in the statistical models that evaluate player value. What Boston has demonstrated through her contract structure, her playoff performances, and the quiet consistency of her daily approach is something that transcends individual achievement. She has shown that it is possible to be both excellent and selfless at the highest level of the sport, that choosing to take less in the short term for the benefit of the whole is not a sacrifice of ambition, but an expression of it. The WNBA has had great players before. It has had players who dominated, who led, who defined eras. What Indiana has in Boston is something slightly different, a player whose greatness is inseparable from her investment in the people around her, whose ceiling as an individual is directly connected to how high she is willing to help everyone else climb first. That particular combination is extraordinarily rare, and the franchise that recognized it early enough to build around it is already reaping rewards that the salary chart only partially reflects. When Caitlin Clark reaches epic eligibility in 2027 and signs the contract that every projection in the league anticipates, Indiana will own the two largest contracts in WNBA history simultaneously. That has never happened before. Two players on the same roster, both at the summit of the league's salary structure, both having arrived there through a framework that rewards early excellence rather than accumulated tenure. The Fever's front office under Amber Cox will have engineered something structurally unprecedented, not through reckless spending or short-term thinking, but through a deliberate sequencing of financial commitments that began the moment Boston agreed to take less in year one so that the roster around her could remain whole. That decision, made quietly before any of the contract announcements generated headlines, is the foundation everything else is built on. The echo of it will be felt across Indiana's competitive window for years. What Indiana is assembling is not a super team in the conventional sense. It is something more durable than that, a franchise with two generational players at its core, a coaching system sophisticated enough to multiply what both of them do, and a supporting cast retained through financial discipline rather than sacrifice to it. Steph White's system, Boston's interior dominance, Clark's shooting and playmaking, Mitchell's offensive creation, Hull's defensive toughness, these are not pieces that happen to land together by accident. They are the result of an organization that understood what it was building before the rest of the league fully recognized it. The contract that changed everything was never really about the money. It was about what the money revealed, that in Indiana, two players had decided the most powerful thing they could do with their leverage was use it to make everyone around them harder to beat. That is the story the numbers tell when you read them correctly. And the final chapter has not been written yet.